What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 meta decks for the competitive February 2021 format. Blazing Vortex will be released later this week, and even though it is a new set introducing a lot of new cards into the game, we're not expecting a lot of changes to be coming from this set in the initial breakout, right? I mean, we've seen even in the OCG, Blazing Vortex didn't have the biggest impact on the game, although it does definitely support some archetypes that are competitively relevant. However, we are still going to be covering the top 5 decks of the current format that we've seen performing all throughout January and even prior to that as the meta has begun to shift. So that way, if you're playing in any competitive event, you can best prepare yourself to be able to take on these top meta threats. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So kicking things off at number 5, it should be no surprise that this deck is in here because let's be honest, this deck's probably been in the top 5 for the better part of a year, and that deck is of course Eldlich. Wanting to maintain its throne, Eldlich has continued to impress throughout the latter half of last year, and it's going strong at the beginning of this one. When you look at Eldlich specifically, there's so many different variants you can play. For this number 5 slot, though, we are going to be talking about more of a pure Eldlich, incorporating, of course, Red Eyes Dark Dragoon. Red Eyes Dark Dragoon really gives the deck a lot of firepower that it needs, but pure Eldlich is just fine as is. All the trap cards right now are actually very strong in a slower format, and so if you win or lose the die roll, yeah, sure, you're going to have your hand traps to supplement you, but just setting some back row and passing, you can actually feel pretty confident that you're going to survive and use that inevitability that Eldlich has to ensure that that's how you win the game. Trap cards are amazing right now. Torrential Tribute's a huge blowout card. You've got stuff like Ice Dragon's Prison, which hits so many different things. You even got stuff like the Solemn Brigade, which is great at just stopping your opponent's tempo and making sure that you have the initiative in most positions. Pair that with something like Dragoon, and you've got a match made in heaven. This deck has been doing extraordinarily well, and I felt it definitely deserved a spot because, yes, it is Eldlich. Obviously, some people are sick of this deck at this point, but that doesn't take away from how powerful the deck is. The inevitability that this deck has is just insane. The recursive capabilities that the deck just keeps grinding turn after turn after turn, going through those Sanguines, those Conquistador, those Vaqueros. Every single card in this deck just floats into something else, and if you pile Dragoon on top of that, it is just an absolute nightmare for your opponent to deal with. So that's why I've got Dragoon Eldlich as my number 5 spot. But coming in at number 4, we have a deck that is actually re-entering the top 5 meta decks list after being off of it for quite some time, and that's partially due to the fact that the ban list kind of hit this deck pretty hard, but people have figured out how to re-engineer it and adapt it for this particular format, and that deck is Dragon Link. Yes, Dragon Link never exactly left the format, but when you consider the hits with stuff like Dragon Buster, Destruction Sword, and Link Cross and the like, this deck definitely suffered a pretty significant hit, maybe one of the biggest compared to most other decks. Now, did that stop the Dragon Link players from going to the tank and figuring out what they can best do with this deck? Of course not. It just took some time for the deck to be re-engineered and adapted for this particular metagame, and I think it's finally time for Dragon Link to resurface. Now, when you look at some of these lists for Dragon Link, they do look very similar to before, and you definitely lost a lot of the consistent win conditions that the deck had because Link Cross was just a free extender in most instances. You also had the Dragon Buster Destruction Sword, which just locked people out of playing the game and was just completely unfair in most instances. But even with those cards out of the equation, this deck is still incredible because it has 1-card starters that can usually result in multiple negation boards, and especially depending on the direction you go, some people are adding the Dragon Maids because of Dragon Maid Tidying being both an extender and a way to disrupt your opponent in case you get stopped by any of your opponent's interruption. But you also have so many options for going second because this deck can play through a reasonable amount of interruption, and with the way the meta is looking, because with so many players focused on some of the other top decks at the moment, some of these cards don't necessarily interact with Dragon Link at all, and that is an opportunity for this deck to come out and shine. At the most recent LCS 3v3 this past weekend, Dragon Link actually fared very well and had a very decent conversion rate on top of it, and I think we're going to continue to see this trend moving forward because with Dragon Link now re-entering the metagame, people are going to have to worry about yet a former combo deck that a lot of people know how powerful and scary this deck can be, and so maybe their strategies will have to readjust, maybe their side decks or maybe their hand trap selection is going to have to go into question, but at the end of the day, this deck is scary. This deck can put up multiple negation boards, which ultimately result in this deck winning most of the time, and this deck can just win games out of absolute nowhere. You guys know from the previous months how strong of a deck Dragon Link is, so I would not be surprised to see that now that people have figured out how it's positioned in the meta, if it's able to come back, it's no surprise that I've got Dragon Link sitting at number 4. Now, coming coming in at number 3, we have yet another Eldlich variant, and what I believe to be the strongest of the Eldlich variants, because when you incorporate Eldlich with Zoodiac, you just get one of the most harmonious decks ever created in Zoodiac Eldlich. This deck is just incredible. The way that these archetypes synergize with one another is fantastic, and you want to talk about inevitability, this deck can pile on pressure like no other. You already have the fact that you have the recursive capabilities from the Eldlich engine that basically make it almost impossible for you to get killed, but then you pair that with the Zoodiacs, which are more of a aggressive deck and can actually go into tools like Zeus to be able to wipe the opponent's board and then allow you to set up with your Eldlich cards, so that way you're just going to completely overrun your opponent in card advantage. That is just incredible. Zoodiac Eldlich has just continued to impress me month after month, and I firmly believe that it is still one of the strongest decks of the current competitive format because more people are playing it. It just keeps having an incredible showing, and when you see what this deck is capable of doing, it is just truly remarkable. Now, at the beginning of this video, I did mention Blazing Vortex, and the reason I did that is because one of the decks that actually gets buffed as a result of this set, at least in my opinion, is Zoodiac Eldlich, and that is because of the brand new Pot of Prosperity. One of the biggest weaknesses of the Zoodiac Eldlich deck is when you're not able to find both halves of the engine and merge them together. Sometimes you'll find hands where you have a Zoodiac but no Eldlich, or vice versa. Pot of Prosperity can actually enable this deck to find both halves of the equation, and if you can then do that, then your entire deck is online. Maybe it isn't necessary, but it is something that in the OCG for their Zoodiac Eldlich variants, they seem very adamant on playing, and we might see this trend continue here in the TCG. It does have a little bit of a high cost because you do have to banish monsters from your extra deck, and there are a lot of monsters that you want to take advantage of, mainly the Zoodiacs, but even the Link monsters themselves, like Asa, Link Spider, and the like, you want to make sure you have these at your disposal, especially for those mirror matches that can be one hell of a grind. However, I still think this deck is incredible. Some of the synergies that allow you to just make both of the engines work so well together. When you have access to cards like Zeus, when you have access to the Eldlich cards, you can really just deal with anything in this deck and grind your opponent's plays to a halt. And then the fact that you still have room to accommodate a reasonable amount of hand traps on top of it, this deck is just a house, and I do not expect this deck to be going anywhere anytime soon. So for those reasons, that's why I have Zoodiac Eldlich as my number 3 spot. We're quickly making our way to that coveted number 1 spot, but we still have to get through number 2. Now, quite honestly, I think you could put either one of these decks as the number 1 because it is super close, but I do have a specific reason for putting them in this order. So for our number 2 deck, we have Drytron, formerly the best deck if you look at the January list. But when it comes to this format in particular, I think a lot of people have started to analyze and really isolate the weaknesses that Drytron has, and they have actually started to side deck for the deck appropriately. One of the biggest statistics that came out of this past weekend's 3v3 LCS is the amount of people that were side decking specific cards for that Drytron matchup specifically. A card like Ally of Justice Psycho Reader, for instance, was one of the most side decked cards of the format, and this card can just absolutely hose the Drytron matchup. And when you have other cards like Droll Lockbird flying around and the like, people were prepared for this deck in particular. And so when the best deck starts to get heavily targeted and when the deck has so many weaknesses, then that's when the deck starts to get dragged down a little bit, and competitive players will start to think, well, if so many people are targeting this deck in particular, maybe I shouldn't play what people consider the best deck of the format and maybe play, let's say, the second best or the third best deck, because then I won't be as susceptible to my opponent just hosing me with these particular side deck cards. And that is something that you do have to consider when you're going into any of these tournaments, but that doesn't take away from what Drytron is capable of doing. This deck is able to spam like no other. You've got incredible link climbing capabilities. You've got access to all the broken ritual cards if you want to go a Herald of Ultimateness route or a Megalith route. You have access to stuff like Vanity's Ruler, which just stops your opponent from special summoning altogether, which, let's be honest, in most cases just hoses like 90% of the meta, and that's just good enough, and people have had to play cards in particular to just stop this threat altogether. The deck is crazy, but again, when a lot of people are playing cards to keep the deck at bay, then that's where the deck can really start to hurt, and so that's what's lowered the deck down a peg in my eyes, is that it has just basically become public enemy number 1. And so now, although it still sees a ton of play and it's still one of the most represented and one of the most powerful decks of the format, I am going to put it in that number 2 slot because I think so many people are just gunning after it that I feel that it's almost a hindrance in some instances to actually want to play a deck like this, but it doesn't take away from what this deck is capable of doing. This deck is still absurd, but there is one one deck that I feel is still better. And that is going to bring us to our number one meta deck of the competitive February 2021 format. And if you haven't already figured it out, I don't know where you've been for the past several months, because that deck is, of course, Virtual World. With so many people targeting Drytron as the new deck to beat, this gave Virtual World an opportunity to one-up Drytron, because so many people figured, well, if everyone's just going to side deck or even main deck all these cards to beat this deck, why would I not just play something like Virtual World, which all these cards don't really do anything against, and I can play a deck that's just as powerful in some instances and do just fine. And that's what a lot of people did. We saw this from the LCS 3v3 this past weekend. Virtual World was the most represented deck and also had the highest conversion rate in Top Cut. And so I think you're starting to see this trend now where we were going towards Drytron, but now we're pivoting back towards Virtual World. And so Virtual World, I think, is going to be the new public enemy number one. Another reason I wanted to put Virtual World in the number one spot is because Blazing Vortex actually does bring a new wave of support to Virtual World in the form of two cards. We have the Virtual World 2/2, which is another level 6 monster that allows you to go into rank 6 plays a lot easier, and there are some cool things that you can do with that. I actually talked about that in my Meta Ahead series if you want to check that out. But there's also the brand new Virtual World Gate Zhuanwu, which is basically just another extender for the deck, and even though it's just played as a one-of, it allows you to possibly play through an interruption, and that way you're able to more consistently get to your true King of All Calamities end board, even through something like a hand trap. This deck is still an absolute monster, and it's something you definitely need to be prepared for, because if your deck is not ready to take on true King of All Calamities, you are going to have a miserable time in this format. The deck can just so consistently pump out these monsters, but even besides that, it can pivot to so many other plays as well. I mean, don't forget about QB. QB's still an incredible card, being able to just act as this like floating macrocosmos that recurs all the time. Access to the level 6 and level 9 synchro pools, as well as the rank 6s as well, is something that this deck is very proficient at, giving it a wide array of a toolbox of options that it can go into, and the deck is just incredible. Yes, it may suffer from a bit of consistency issues. Pot of Disparity coming out in the brand new set could help alleviate this to a degree. I think Pot of Desires is still probably better, because I think getting those two cards is better than maybe picking one, but that's obviously an argument up for debate that I'd love to hear what you guys have to say down in the comments. But in the OCG, I've seen some builds of Virtual World of people playing both Pot of Desires and Pot of Prosperity, just so they have the options to make the deck more consistent, so that way they can pretty much make up for the fact that consistency is one of the issues with Virtual World. But we always say that this deck has consistency issues, and yet this deck is just one event after event after event after event for the past, I don't know what, 3 or 4 months now. That has not stopped it. This deck is just incredible, and I don't expect it to be going anywhere anytime soon, although we do have a ban list coming up at the end of the month, so maybe we'll start to see things change after Virtual World has been on this tirade. But nonetheless, Virtual World, it's not going anywhere. It is a behemoth of a deck, and that's why I've got it as my number one meta deck of February 2021. So guys, that's gonna wrap it up for the video. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider supporting me on Patreon for exclusive one-day early access to the Yu-Gi-Oh progression series and the history of Yu-Gi-Oh. Thank you all so much for watching the video, and we will see you next time.